Let's have a real conversation for your holiday listening. Hello, everyone. I'm Lou Zaccarella. Welcome again to the Better Satellite World, a podcast of space and satellite professionals international, and happy holidays. The Better Satellite World podcast is supported by the corporate partners of SSPI, Eutelsat, EchoStar Hughes, Peraton, and Access Intelligence, content with context. Additional support comes from the 3,000 professional members of SSPI and its 17 chapters around the globe. Thank you. But David Letterman has a show on Netflix titled, I Believe My Next Guest Needs No Introduction. And that is a perfect introduction to my guest today. After 26 years as the Paris Bureau Chief for Space News, where he covered the commercial, launch, and international space business, Peter B. de Selding co-founded SpaceIntelReport.com. For the past 3 years, serving as its editor, Space Intel Report has maintained the most accurate, reliable, insightful reporting of the industry and has continued the legacy, my editorial opinion here, of the industry's greatest journalist and its must-read reporter. We have heard a lot about fake news during the past 48 months. Well, whatever fake news is, Peter's reporting is its diametric opposite. In 2015, I had the pleasure of giving Peter a Better Satellite World Award for his work of over about 3 decades of holding the industry's leaders to an ethos of transparency. Case in point, this subhead from this morning's Space Intel report, quote, any rocket company chief executive must have nightmares about this. You're alone in the public docket, having to explain a failure for which the only credible cause lies inside your own house. The question then is, do you face the music or try to change the tune? Well, to me, that is quintessential to Selding. And I have the essential to Selding with me here today. Peter, welcome to the Better Satellite World.
Lou, nice to be here.
Well, it's always great to hear your voice. A question, where did that last phrase come from, that title you just wrote? I know it's relating to Avio's CEO.
Oh, yeah. Well, there are several dozen launch startups. Some have got money, some don't, but I think you could say well over 20 that have some support going on right now. And they're all very exciting, a lot of smart young people, and you could wish success for all of them, but most of them are not going to succeed. And that's part of their harsh reality of the jungle in which they're operating.
Yep.
In an industry, the launcher sector, which has never made much money, never. And I guess what struck me about this, there was a briefing today on the heels of a pretty bad failure a month ago of the Vega rocket. Mm-hmm. And it was, the cause of the failure was so obvious. It really was an unusual thing, because you wonder how this sort of stuff can slip through. You can blame COVID, but what interests me, we did another story about the briefing's findings, but I just wanted to find out what a CEO does in that circumstance. All the instincts he has.
Right.
And to boot, this company is publicly traded, the only pure play launch vehicle company to be publicly traded. So he's got all the incentives in the world to want to sort of pour whipped cream on it all and try to make it go away somehow. But you can't. And so I wanted to judge how he comported himself in about an hour-long briefing, where his customers, his government paymasters were all there, and having spoken before him, saying basically that his shop really, really messed up, and would have to be under much stricter control now by outside people for the foreseeable future to make sure it didn't happen again.
Right.
And I thought he did a pretty damn good job of acquitting himself with a maximum amount of frankness, answering questions that he would have been able to dodge because he's a sharp guy, but didn't dodge. And maybe that's the best way to do it. Lou, if you've got kids, as I do, there are two types of parents. The type of parent who pulls off the Band-Aid very slowly because you don't want to, hurt the child or anything. And the type of parent who pulls it off quickly, knowing that the net pain endured is less if you pull it off quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a really, really difficult lesson for someone whose company is just messed up and who's got to face head on a failure to learn. But I thought that the CEO of Avio in this case did a damn good job of it, and I think it's what he said should be a model for the way any CEO really anywhere. But I'm thinking particularly of rockets because the failures are so stark.
Yeah.
You've got quickly $200 million that just went, in this case, into the Arctic Ocean.
Yeah. Exactly. And of course, he probably knew you were listening, so maybe that was an incentive for him. So Giulio Ranzo just breathed a sigh of relief when he hears this. But you're absolutely right. I mean, truth just cuts through everything, and yet, because of the egos and everything, we just tend to try to do everything else. We think we're so clever, but as I said in my introduction, that's what you bring to this business that I think is really unique. You cut through that, and you get right to the heart of the human issue behind it as well. And I really admire that. It's such three-dimensional writing. And I've never asked you this. How did you get started in journalism?
So I don't know. I suppose I was in secondary school and started getting a whiff of this stuff, and my parents at the time, which was financing my secondary school education, were not at all for this. But and they thought I'd grow out of it,
Mhm.
and I might have, but didn't. So so there we go.
You're right. You grew up in New York, right? As I remember.
Connecticut.
Connecticut. Okay. The Northeast. So, well, it's a good thing you didn't grow out of it for all of us. Was there a moment when you sort of embraced the identity of a journalist? Because I mean, you are, and I know I'm flattering you, and I probably shouldn't do that on this podcast, but you are the quintessential reporter in my view. As growing up, you were the guy that I would look to and say, "This is who I'm going to read because I'm going to get the truth, and I'm going to get a little bit more." Was there a moment when you embraced that, when you said, I'm a journalist"?
Well, sure, yeah, and the I guess one part of it, and there are lots of ways of being a thing, lots of ways of being a lawyer or a journalist, whatever you are. Um, but the industries that I've covered in the last, I guess I'm stuck in the space industry now. I've been here for more than a quarter of a century.
Mhm.
Is either you're a space geek that happens to be a journalist, or you're a journalist who happens to be covering the space industry. And I've always been the latter.
Yeah,
And there's a
yeah,
difference.
yeah,
There's a difference.
yeah. There sure is. Let's get down to cases here because we've just come through a heck of a year. 2020 was probably one of the most eventful years in our lifetime. Uh, from the perspective of the industry in which you are a journalist,
Hmm.
what was the biggest and most important story for you from the year?
Well, there are several to choose from, but sticking with on the business side, the side that is supposed to make money, and leaving aside the fact that the United Arab Emirates is now going to Mars, or that China just returned lunar samples and Japan just returned asteroid samples, and that's really cool stuff.
Amazing.
Um, there is I guess a couple of things. First, the industry was able to, for lots of reasons, uh, get through this first and second wave of COVID, and maybe now we don't talk about COVID as much in 6 months' time. I hope that's the case, but without a whole lot of damage. Governments have stepped in. Some have redone the way they do contracting to help industry with liquidity issues. This is particularly true for small and mid-sized companies, as you know, Lou. And they're
Mhm.
the people who can't just go months without being paid by their government customer. And some governments have taken their 30-day cycle of payment and cut it in half, or even more, to keep money in the pipeline, so that some of these technology providers who really don't have a whole lot of other seat to sit on, uh, they can survive the COVID crisis without failing. Because I think some of them would have failed were it not for the fact that they were given access to liquidity by their customers who weren't legally obliged to pay them at that moment.
Right.
So
Right.
that was a big deal. So the space industry itself, when you look at all kinds of other industries, did came out of this really easily, and that's got to be clear from the start. You walk down the street, and you know what the average restaurant margin is. You just
Hmm.
know it, and
Yep.
a lot of them are not going to survive. Small shoe stores, independent bookstores, just all kinds of people who working hard to make a living, and we're making a living, but not much of one, are going to be are never going to come up from under this, even if we get a vaccine really rolling in by mid-year. So the space industry has really nothing to moan about. And in fact, during the same year as COVID, you've seen what history might call us, and we'll talk in a couple of years, is a bubble. A bubble. Even during COVID, there's a bubble. The
Yeah,
S&P 500 is hitting records.
it's
Um,
amazing. Yeah.
the uh, 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 Companies that have never produced the good or the service for which they, were born and created, and about which they sold themselves to investors, are now getting valuations that are really extraordinary. Now, again, maybe these are all sage investors who will be rewarded in the end for being what look like unreasonable, but they'll turn out winners. The old saying is that the world is makes progress only with unreasonable people, and that's
Right.
true.
Hmm.
What that phrase misses is that in a whole lot of all those unreasonable people failed along the way. So I think that we're possibly in for a washout in some sectors of the commercial space industry. I mentioned launch earlier, but it's not just launch. You've now got uh, uh, you might remember, Luce, many years ago, a decade or so ago, there was a special purpose acquisition company that bought Iridium, and I didn't know what a SPAC was at the time.
That's
And
right.
now they've come roaring back. Of course, in Iridium's case, Iridium already had a business in the first generation of satellites that was generating some revenue. They came out of bankruptcy. But in the case of what we're seeing now, and it's not just the special purpose acquisition companies, but other investors as well, you're getting funding levels and valuations that you'd normally associate with a company that's well past first revenue,
Right.
and yet these companies aren't. So, some of them will have cracked the code on new technologies, and will move forward, and we celebrate them. And some will fail. And I only hope that these investors going into these very speculative things, this is beyond businessman's risk, are aware of what the risks are, and that nobody's betting their retirement on this.
Yeah.
I wouldn't like to see a lot of 401ks going into some of these investments.
Right. Yeah, because you certainly haven't outlawed the business cycle in general, but as you say, some of it does seem disproportionately irrational. And I mean, you're a student of history, as am I. Does it remind you of the late 1920s at all?
Well, even on the tech side, how about the late 1990s? It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be
Right.
a great depression that ensues. It just has to be a washout. Then it was certain aspects of the dot-com or the telecom sector, fiber overbuilding. And you could argue these things are all good. It's part of the way, the circle of life, right? Um,
Right.
but it is. I do wonder about the knock-on effects for the wider industry if there are a bunch of companies that make a lot of press that later fail. But I hope it's not the case. Anyway, so that was certainly one of the salient um, uh, developments of 2020, so far as I could tell. The other one was the uh, the change in the broadband scene. For
Mm,
several years,
yeah.
people have investors or others who would message me saying, "Why aren't you covering more about the constellations?" And I said, "Well, I do cover them, but the fact is that they've got to progress more. It really can't be just a bunch of FCC filings." And this year we saw, and I'll admit I was surprised, SpaceX really going all in.
Right.
Remember when SpaceX launched is 60 Starlink satellites at a go, and they're doing that now on a rhythm of a little more often than once a month. That's a cost to that company. That's not revenue generating.
No.
So going all in for them, they're really all in. Now,
Hmm.
SpaceX can get all kinds of valuations from investors coming in, and that's fine. But this is a big bet they're making with their investors' money and with some of their own money, and it's going to be interesting to see how that works. But certainly, I think we have to accept now that SpaceX is going to meet its regulatory deadlines and will be an operational service where they're able to operate Which regulators will let them in, TBD, but they will be in there. The
You know,
story of the, sorry, go ahead.
well, no, I was going to say I think you reported on that the other day, and you reported on the issue that they have maintained that anyone that doesn't share spectrum, you know, probably shouldn't be considered as they've been considered. Is that significant to you?
No, but it's certainly true. They were preaching to the choir with some of their people there, and they were also, obviously SpaceX is thinking about its own business, and SpaceX is a second, has not got a primary. It's got to make way for OneWeb, which has the primary allocation. This doesn't mean SpaceX has to ask OneWeb for permission. It just means that in the way the ITU makes its hierarchies, they have a little less priority than OneWeb does, and so they have to be a little more aware of OneWeb than OneWeb has to be aware of SpaceX, even though in both directions it's true. But certainly OneWeb, that's the other top 5 story of the year. This extraordinary turnabout where SoftBank, because of a lot of things going on in other of its investments, if you followed WeWork, then you know what I mean, was having trouble and decided they no longer were seduced by the OneWeb story, and so they wanted out, and so OneWeb went into bankruptcy, and it wasn't clear how that was going to happen. Certainly, it wasn't outlandish to think that it would be sold for a catch and kill type of play, where the buyer just wants to get rid of it and use some of the spectrum,
Right.
or because the U.S. government refused to allow a consideration of a Chinese buyer, and there were a couple there that came up with some interesting possible cash offers. But anyway, so then the British government swooped in.
Yeah.
Who could have predicted that? Nobody. And the story of
No.
how that happened really hasn't been written yet. I hope to write it in the next 6 months or so. But it was an amazing thing with a band of jolly people mainly in London, but also in Washington. In fact, OneWeb told me this is originally an idea in the U.S. government. Why don't you get the British government to go in here on an equity play? We can't do it, but they might be able to. And then you got Bharti Global, a big
Right.
mobile network operator in India, and 9 or 10 other countries, a very serious client, fully capitalist loaded in the way they think about things. And those two now sit with the 95% or so, no, maybe 90% total equity in OneWeb, with the British government holding a golden share. And what's going to be interesting is to see how they fit together in their ambitions. Governments go into investments for strategic reasons. Bharti is not going in this for strategic reasons, because as one rocket maker once told me, whenever you guys hear in the press that we're using the word strategic, that means we make no money. It's code for making no money, right?
Right.
But Bharti doesn't work that way. Bharti wants to make money,
Right.
and it'll be fascinating to see how that works out. And so that's two. That one of the few sure things in the world, as we've known it for the last several years, is that Amazon makes a lot of money, and for them to do anything daring, anything that might actually cause their investors to sit up and say, it has to be a multi-billion-dollar bet. And Jeff Bezos has been very clear about this. So he said that the Kuiper Systems, which is an Amazon company, and their broadband LEO system will cost about $10 billion. And he can waste that. And even if it blows, it's okay. That's a very honest thing. Very few companies can say that sort of thing. I'm not sure SpaceX can.
For 10 billion, no.
But until we get access to SpaceX's P&L, we won't know. So Amazon is in there. That makes 3. Toward the end of the year, just a few weeks ago, this investor spat between the Canadian Pension Fund and L'Oreal, the two owners of Telesat, have now finally come to an agreement that would allow Telesat to be publicly traded via basically taking over L'Oreal's spot on the stock exchange. And both investors now have made noises that they like Telesat's LEO project.
Yes.
Which has always been voted, most likely to succeed in school by virtue of its design.
Right.
But unlike SpaceX and unlike Amazon, it doesn't have massive resources to throw at this without consequence. What it does have is a lot of experience in the satellite telecom industry, and it's got a going business that makes money. So Telesat, we'll know in the next 2 or 3 months, might be a fourth. That
Hmm.
makes 4 LEO broadband systems attacking different markets, sure, but still 4 LEO broadband systems. And LEO means worldwide, plus one maybe in China, maybe two, or
Right.
maybe zero, maybe. And then the European Union is thinking about doing something on its own. We'll see about that. But now we can certainly bank on the fact that there are 3 and maybe 4 LEO broadband systems that are going to be at least alive long enough to make a go of it by
Yeah.
by meeting their deadlines and launching their satellites. And that should scare the bejesus out of a lot of other satellite telecom operators because they don't know how much business these guys can really take. And in terms of Amazon or SpaceX, they don't know how much money they can throw at the problem before they make a profit.
Right. Right. Does it suggest to you, Peter, that we really have entered into what I referred to actually in a book that I wrote a long time ago, the broadband economy, where we're transforming the entire infrastructure, developing the digital face for just about every type of business and application, and that the UK, which looked at this years ago and declared that they want, I think, was 7 or 8% of the global space market or something, that they're all looking at this now and looking at that landscape and saying this is going to be, a significant transformation of the way the world works and communicates and and does everything. Is that what this is all pointed toward? Because no one can really measure that market, can they?
No, so you take an endpoint. You know that everybody in every country, everywhere, the poorest village in Bangladesh, and the richest cat in Manhattan, they all want more broadband, and the more you give them, the more they're going to want.
That's right.
That's we know that's true. Okay, so you
Hmm.
start from there. So that's a good place to be. You're not trying to sell a special type of donut or hamburger. You know that everybody's going to want what this is selling. What you don't know is whether the architecture of your system is what's required to serve that market because a LEO system is global. And despite what you and I might like to think, the regulatory world, planet regulatory is not moving as fast as planet technology. And the a LEO constellation is going to have landing rights, and I presume at least several big markets outside Western Europe and the United States. Because in Western Europe and the United States, there are several companies, and you know them. They're called Eutelsat and Viasat and Hughes Network Systems, and maybe a couple of others in geo are going to be defending their territory, as will the terrestrial wireless and wired businesses in those highly
Hmm.
technology developed markets. So you're going to have to
Yep.
go somewhere else
Hmm.
to make the business. And of course, your satellites are spending all kinds of time out of those territories anyway. So it's really uneconomic to have a LEO system unless you've got a worldwide marketplace. And how
Right.
China is going to react and India is going to react, and the two of them together are what, 38% of the world's population,
Hmm.
somewhere around there, is going to be really, really important.
And
And
an increasing amount of their economy, of its
and increasing
economy.
amount of economy. And those guys
Yeah.
aren't going to sit down and just let you come in there with your stuff, even if they wanted to. But for the technology, they're not going to let Chinese citizens just go onto the web and do whatever they want.
That's for sure.
They don't right now. I don't know when the last time you were in China, but you can't get on. I couldn't get
Yeah.
the New York Times or Google Mail when I was in China.
That's right.
So
And
that's
India is
and
a closed market still. Yeah.
yes, and some parts of it are open, part of it not. China is a very complicated piece of kit, as we all know.
Hmm.
But in India too, India, one of the big stories of this year may be, and I didn't want to mention it because it's one of those things where you think you see something coming out of the ground, but you're not sure when it's going to come out and how big it's going to be. And that will be the deregulation of the Indian satellite telecom market.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, India's got a huge appetite for this. They've had a savage competition inside India among cellular providers. So India is, if you ever visit India is a
Hmm.
democracy, and it feels like one when you're there. But the Indian government has not let this market breathe free. And then several months ago, the prime minister said, we're going to change all that. So there's a draft law now that hasn't been passed yet. And really, you can't pop the champagne until it is, that might open up that market. Uh, and who knows, maybe the investment in OneWeb by uh, Sunil Bharti Mittal will help this happen. Here's a guy who's given a lot to India. He's made a pile of money, but he's given a lot to India. You don't get to be that many subscribers to his stuff without having an awful lot of people who are using it. And maybe the Indian government, by virtue of the OneWeb investment of Bharti, will decide they're going to open up their market to broadband. In which case, they probably want to open it up for SpaceX or Telesat or Amazon Kuiper as well. Instead of
And Hughes
opening
is already over there, right? Hughes is already in India.
Well, Hughes has been in India for 2 decades and has been beating its head against a wall trying to get an Indian-owned company to allow them to launch a satellite into geostationary orbit that would cover India for broadband. And these satellites, even the big ones, they're not going to do, they're not going to dominate the market for Indian broadband. But Hughes thought they could make a nice business of it, and they spent years trying to shake loose regulatory reform, and they've been through a lot of false peaks and a lot of false dawns. And maybe now with Modri's regulatory proposal, if it gets through, maybe Hughes now will be able to do something. In which case, it's got to decide. Hughes has got interests in OneWeb. Hughes has got interests in geo broadband, and Hughes, obviously, if they're making money on both sides, will argue that both can coexist and so on. But so India that's not a story that's over yet. But there are instances like that where you just take the big population centers in Africa, in South America, in East Asia, in South Asia, some in Central area, not so much population, but big areas where they should be clients for this sort of stuff because populations are spread out, and you have to wonder when how willing they are to open up their broadband market to foreign companies. And that's a real question. Ask Iridium how long it took them to get landing rights in how many countries. Ask Inmarsat. The world has not changed that much from them. It has changed somewhat, but not radically. It's still a real pain.
Right. And then as you report on, the regulatory regimes have to catch up. And so you've got that element as well. It's interesting that Modi also has sort of simultaneously in India the 100 Smart Cities initiative. And if you're going to have these quote smart cities, these connected cities, as sort of an anchor to your economy and a consumer economy that's increasingly growing into the middle class, you are going to need more connectivity, right? So to your point, if they can sort of open up, bring in these technologies, perhaps the thinking is maybe we can accelerate this process.
Yes, I'm sure you and I would agree with that. The question is, can the Indian bureaucracy, which now has been afraid of doing this, be persuaded that this is what's best for its people? I mean, it's not so much digital India here, unless you include villages, the thousands and thousands of villages where broadband is either non-existent or very, very poor. Those are the places where a SpaceX or an Amazon Kuiper or maybe a OneWeb eventually are going to want to go, and that's what SUNY Mittal has been talking about. And that's it's such a huge market there. I mean, this is a country that's going to be the most populous country in the world in the next 5 years or so. It's the opportunities are enormous for any satellite company, even if you just touch the surface of the total market. So it's I hope that's going to happen. One of the good pieces of news here, because people are heading off onto their weekend, that sort of thing, is that both Hughes and Viasat, and again, it's a little early, appear to have demonstrated they can make a reasonable profit on stitching together rural Wi-Fi, rural broadband, with Wi-Fi hotspots. And if they can do that, in other words, they can get enough clusters of 50 people who are going to be equivalent from a revenue generating point of view to, say, one US Hughes or Viasat subscriber, that's okay. That Wi-Fi hotspot has served its purpose. If you add together a couple of, the universal service obligation programs that are going on in many countries in the world, not just the United States, but places like Brazil, you can that'll help the bottom line as well. So if that works, isn't that a cool thing that the satellite sector is providing?
Oh,
that. I mean, I live in France, and in France there are many, many, many villages that are really great in the summertime when the tourists come to see them, but otherwise they are being hollowed out by the fact that if
Exactly.
you're an ambitious 18 or 20-year-old, you don't want to stay there.
No.
And one of the ways of keeping them there is by having broadband everywhere. And France, which is only 1/6 the size of the United States or so, doesn't have it anywhere far from it. It's a scandal. And if one day it's going to happen because there is demand there,
Mhm.
and when we see this happening in places like Brazil and Mexico with Hughes and Viasat, it's a really, really good story, and I'm just happy to see it.
It really is, and that boy, you've hit a key point, and a real passion of mine, which is these places get depopulated, their talent leaves, their cultures actually go with them as well. And what you end up seeing, as you say, is this eviscerated type of economy, and it builds a lot of resentment, and there's a political consequence to that.
Well, that's that's
And
that's another sub. You're right. It does.
so, I
There's
mean,
all
it's a
kinds
whole
of
other
knock-on.
conversation. You're right.
You're right. There's a lot of knock-on effects there, and nobody's interests are served by having young, talented people unable to use their talents where they were brought up. If they want to move, move. I did,
Right.
but that's not the point. The point is, if they feel like they've got to move because they're just boxed in there, then that's no good for everybody, for anybody, and no good for governments. And yet, governments are, as you know, some of them have been a little reticent to throw a lot of incentives to satellite broadband development because
Right.
they get hung up on this latency question. I'm sorry about that. That's a bias I have, but I'm not sure how much somebody who doesn't have access to uh, a decent,
Exactly.
2G connection cares about latency.
Right.
Um,
Exactly, Peter. And I'll tell you, again, we know this from the work that we do. If that person believes that they can stay home and be connected to the global economy and has an idea, they're going to use whatever broadband they can get their hands on. And all of a sudden, you've got a different dynamic, and that's exactly what you're describing, isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Um,
it is good. It is, again, these are shoots of blades of grass growing up through the concrete, and I think 2020 began to show that Hughes and Viasat, both successful companies, and both profitable, if they can make it work. And then Eutelsat, as you saw in 2020, also finally made the turn after many years to a commitment. I guess it was more like late 2019, but 2020 is when it really saw itself. Now Eutelsat uh, uh, is one of the few of the classic FSS operators that have decided that broadband, consumer broadband, is its principal engine of growth for the future.
mhm.
That's interesting. Now they can make it work or not. They're going to be competing with people like everybody else, including Viasat. But they've decided this is the horse that we're going to ride for the future.
Yep. And again, we'll have another conversation about that because I want to pick your brain on whether they're right or not, and to see how that's going. Peter, what was the story that surprised the single story that surprised you the most last year, where you started writing it and looking at it and saying, "Man, I would have never guessed this in a billion years."
Well, there are a lot of candidates there too. I think one that I was surprised, maybe I shouldn't have been, that SpaceX did what's necessary to maintain their regulatory viability by launching so many. They've got to launch a pile of satellites, Lou, to make their FCC guide
Yeah.
milestones,
Right.
in a certain time, and they're doing it. Another one that surprised me, I talked about the UK government investment in OneWeb. I certainly
Hmm.
didn't see that coming.
Right.
Another one was the I don't know how much SSPI listeners have followed a company like Virgin Galactic.
Sure.
Despite everything, that company still got, last I checked, something like a $6 billion value at market cap. I mean, it I just I don't get it where you get that kind
Right.
of valuation. And again, it's a really cool thing. The Virgin Galactic people, I think, are very. I like dealing with them when the few times I do, because they're all very honest.
Mhm.
The same. We have had valuations now based on recent investment rounds of companies valuing a startup launcher operator at more than $1 billion.
Right.
Think about that.
Yeah.
Um, and now it's coming with, as I said, with some of these SPACs, with going up into the satellite servicing, or the in orbit taxi service, or satellite to mobile phones. There's a lot of very interesting but very, very risky and unproven stuff that gets a high valuation far in advance of the first nickel of revenue generation. So
it's amazing.
that has been surprising, I think. And I guess the other thing is that, and again, it's a piece of good news, that when the world wants to get, feels like it's in a corner and can't do anything else, it can actually get broadband out to more people. I was reading some numbers recently about just what's happened in China and India in 2020 because of COVID. Okay.
Right.
And the number of people who are now online is a whole lot more than it was a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Unintended
mainly
consequence. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think of these places in France or the United States or other really developed countries where kids are getting their parents to drive them to a local McDonald's because the Wi-Fi beams out into the parking lot.
Right.
Thank you, McDonald's.
Yeah.
And they all do here anyway. And then sitting there do their homework in the parking lot. Well,
Yep.
we can do better than that.
Absolutely. It's such a great point. I always recall kids sitting around from uptown in New York, sitting around the 67th Street Public Library at night. And of course, a lot of the kids were African American, and the neighbors would be getting a little freaked out and everything. Well, as it turns out, they were sitting there getting the Wi-Fi because they couldn't get it in their neighborhood.
Yeah.
Right. And and I would say the exact same thing. We can do better than that. Interesting story, Peter. I was speaking with someone, a director of the industrial policy group in Taiwan a couple nights ago for a webinar that I was doing, and they actually have a program called Go Home, whereby if you have a good business idea, they will provide you with the capital, the financing, to go back to where you came from, so to speak, if it was a small village, and locate your business there. So they actually have an industrial policy now that will allow people to go back home to address some of the things that you've been talking about. And that's good. Yeah, and that's going to be rolling out continuously in 2021. When we talk about 2021, what are you on the lookout for? Where do you have your eagle eye train?
The first, obviously, just what the trajectory of things that are already en route to make sure they don't falter or sputter. So that will be, SpaceX has to launch just as often in 2021 as they have been in 2020. Again, which is all cost of cost of
Right.
stuff. It's not revenue.
Nope.
OneWeb has got to launch now. They launched today, as you know, and I'm still waiting for the final word that all the satellites are speaking in orbit. But they're supposed to be launching now on about a monthly basis. They've got to continue to do that. I would suspect that Telesat, which said they were going to announce something, material capex in their Telesat LEO project by the end of the year. Well, wait, today's the 18th, so we got another 12 days or so to the end of the year. So but I don't really care. But they've got to, when they do it, as long as they do it, they can't wait too long, I should think, because of how much money has been going into places like Kuiper and SpaceX and OneWeb and maybe others. So I would suspect that if we don't hear something from Telesat on that score in the next few months, maybe it won't happen. But again, after their shareholders have smoked a peace pipe and come together on a way forward with Telesat, which they should have done years ago, there's reason for optimism that Telesat might be able to put together the resources necessary to put Telesat LEO into play. But that's another 2021 thing that will happen.
Right.
Other than that, in 2021, we'll know by the first half of 2021 whether the liberalization of the Indian Satcom policy is real or not. That's a first half of the year. I'm sure there are other things I'm just not thinking about right now, but there's certainly more than enough to keep us busy. I'm sure you'll agree.
Yeah, well, you're going to be. Yeah, I was going to say you're going to be busy in 2021. To that India point, by the way, we've just announced the opening of an India chapter, and among the reasons is because they believe internally, the companies there, that there is going to be this opening up of the commercial market. So we'll be there doing webinars and things as well. And so, I think your instincts are right. You're going to see something happen.
Hope so. There have been ASQs. A lot of people have gray hair now and didn't have gray hair when they said it's right around the corner.
That's right.
So, Well,
Um,
there is reason for hope. You're right.
well, you're right. We'll see, and of course, you'll give us the facts on it. In January, late January, in the United States, here where we are today, we'll be seeing a new administration come in. What's been What's your assessment of the Trump administration as it relates to the space and satellite industry? What's been the overall weighting of that in terms of the advancement or not of our industry?
Well, I don't see a whole lot of negatives from the Trump administration as it relates to military or space policy.
Mhm.
I'm sure there's some things that I could think of that people might not like, but on balance, I don't think, whatever else you want to say about the Trump administration, and you can say a lot, the space policy is not a place. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I was talking about this the other day with someone. And they said, "Well, who's going to replace Bridenstine?" And I remember thinking, "Well, do you want to replace Bridenstine?
Right.
I mean, is NASA's office, is the NASA administrator now such a political office you've got to replace him?"
Right.
I don't know. Up until a couple of years ago, the Artemis project was kind of not very fluid and not likely to go forward in a way that's going to generate a lot of international support. But now it is going forward, and it's a very interesting thing. And the United States is gathering together as it should, the International Space Station partners, and we'll see where that leads. I guess one Christmas wish I would have, for the same reason I would have had it in the early 1990s with respect to the Soviet Union becoming Russia, is that somehow NASA be allowed to restart some sort of engagement with China on space matters. Not stuff that's related to missile technology. If you don't want that, that's fine. Although I think China has demonstrated at this point that they can launch vehicles.
Yes.
But you got now the two largest economies, the two most likely to come into conflict among the large economies, and there has to be a way forward. And it's a lot better than ping pong, isn't it? To get together on a space policy when you're doing something like Artemis, which is an enormous challenge. I think that should be possible, and I guess we'll see whether it is.
Yeah, I think that's a great vision too, because it's the only way we're going to get there and to do the types of things we need to do to keep pushing further out into space, but also to create a global space-based economy, which is going to be, I think, enormous. And it does require that. And that's, from a philosophical point of view, I think that's where the human species is headed anyway, to collaborate more. So we better figure it out. And I think that's great wisdom, Peter. Final question. I get it a lot from my team here. What does the B stand for in your name? Seriously, I get asked all the time.
I'm gonna leave that one alone. If you guys, I'll let you chew on that bone. If that.
Oh wow. Okay. Well, okay. We'll have to do our own investigating.
Oh yeah. I'm sure it's out there. Nothing. It was my mother's maiden name. It doesn't.
Okay.
Really, I'll leave you guys to go suss it out somewhere else.
I had to ask. I was obligated to ask. Peter, thank you so much. Have a great holiday, a healthy and safe New Year. We really need you in this industry.
All right, Lou. Thanks very much, and happy holidays to SSPI as well. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. That concludes my conversation with Peter Selding. You can follow Peter on Twitter at PBDES. If you'd like to subscribe to Space Intel Report, go to spaceintelreport.com. It's the best $99 that Bill Clanky makes me spend. SSPI is the voice of the space and satellite professional everywhere in the world, and the industry's largest cross-disciplinary network of people and companies. SSPI connects the people of the invisible, indispensable industry that makes the world better every minute of the day. To learn more about our Better Satellite World podcasts, please go to bettersatelliteworld.com. And if you're not a member of SSPI and would like to know more, go to sspi.org. Student membership is free. Follow us on Twitter at SSPI and check us out on LinkedIn and Facebook. For Space and Satellite Professionals International and our producer, Ana Gomez, I'm Lou Zaccarella, wishing you happy holidays and reminding you to make a better satellite world. Take care, everybody.